True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Pat Taylor and Tom Allanson came together after each of them left failing marriages. At 30, Tom was younger than Pat by about 6 years. He'd been through 2 short, very bad marriages, and she had escaped one long marriage where she said that she felt trapped and smothered by her military husband. Now, both of them had been looking for the perfect love most of their lives, and despite the odds, they seemed to have found it in one another. From the outside, though, they appeared to have nothing more in common than sex. Tom was tall and strong as an ox. Pat was tiny-boned and fragile. Many would compare her to a bird. She liked to be seen as a delicate Southern lady. Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind was her role model. Tom wouldn't be the first to be taken in by Pat, a lifelong manipulator, and he wasn't the last. Pat had ideas about what she wanted in life, and absolutely nothing would get in her way. So throughout her life, Pat feigned illness, made false police reports, tore apart families, and planned multiple murders. And no one was exempt from her devious schemes, even those that she claimed to love. In A Dark Heart today, we examine the relationships and evil acts of Pat Taylor Allanson. This is a woman who left behind a string of broken families and lost lives in an effort to obtain the unattainable, perfection. And speaking of perfection, Dick says he has the perfect beer for us today.
Well, I do. I actually have a beer from Atlanta, and that's where most of this action takes place.
Beautiful.
In Atlanta or its exurbs.
Yes.
So the beer I have today is Transmigration of Souls, brewed by Orpheus Brewing in Atlanta. It's a double IPA. Everybody makes these things.
Double IPAs?
IPAs, DIPAs, triple IPAs.
West Coast IPAs?
East Coast, West Coast. There's IPAs for everybody.
They're big.
So this one, Transmigration of Souls, is a hazy orange color with a big, huge, fluffy white head, and it left a huge amount of lace on the sides of the glass.
That's always pretty.
Pretty beer. It had a fruity and kind of a floral aroma. And when you taste it, mostly fruit. Orange, maybe a little tangerine, some mango. It's a medium-bodied beer, and it drinks pretty easily, which makes it a little bit dangerous because it's 10% alcohol by volume.
So that could sneak up on you.
It could. You could find yourself kind of paralyzed.
So don't drink alone, kind of like the Dateline theme. Don't drink it alone.
Don't drink it alone, and probably don't pound down 2 or 3 of them in quick succession.
Well, I wasn't planning on doing that, so I'm safe.
No.
No.
We'll be good.
Okay.
But nice beer.
Okay, thanks. Let's open it up.
All right.
Here we are, back at the quiet end.
Yeah, it's good to be back. You know, I missed this bunch of ragamuffins.
Yes.
I shouldn't call them that, should I?
No, those are endearing names.
They are.
I believe.
We were gone for a week or so, took a little vacation, and went someplace we'd never been.
Yes, we did.
The desert Southwest. Had a good time in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been to New Mexico, but not southern New Mexico
We have
before.
not been to southern New Mexico. That's
Right.
correct. And the beer scene there is, to me, a burgeoning one. It's not as advanced as the New England beer scene.
Right, yeah.
So it's more of a newfound beer scene that's progressing quickly. There's breweries coming up all over the place.
So there's hope for the future there.
Big hope.
All right,
I mean,
good.
just in the area we were in southern New Mexico, there was half a dozen breweries.
That's pretty good.
And they're all pretty new.
Yeah, and how many are up in Albuquerque?
Oh, geez.
20 or so?
It looked like 20.
Yeah.
I mean, a huge number.
Yeah,
So it's good to be back at our own quiet end.
it certainly is, yes. Why don't you start out our story today?
Well, sure. So Patricia Van Taylor Allanson was born in 1937. She was adored by her aunts and especially by her grandmother. Now, her mother came from a big family. There was 10 girls in the family?
Yeah,
It's a
huge Southern family.
Huge Southern family. Patricia was a very pretty child with big green eyes and dark blonde hair. And she was very clever, grew up to be a beautiful teenager. Now, she was spoiled by her mother, Marguerite, and her stepfather, Colonel Clifford Radcliffe. So she did grow up as a bit of an army brat and had a lot of experiences growing up because they were posted at different places.
Yeah, so maybe she was a bit precocious?
It sounds like she might have been.
Yeah.
And she had a younger stepbrother named Kent, and she just loved to bully and tease poor old Kent.
Yeah, that's what the word is, that she was mean to him.
Yeah, when we talk bullying, meanness, mean bullying.
Yeah,
I don't know if there's unmean bullying, but...
Well, she wasn't teasing in fun, that's for sure.
She wasn't.
No.
So this bullying behavior did reveal a darker side to Pat. We find out that if she didn't get her way, she would throw a tantrum. And if the tantrum didn't work, she could manipulate her way out of it. She learned how to charm both men and women, especially to get something that she wanted.
But she wasn't all that successful in the end, even after all she did.
No, she wasn't.
No.
All her lies and manipulations eventually crumbled on her. She didn't get everything.
Yeah.
Ended up actually with pretty much nothing.
She did. She really blew it. Now, Pat married first at the very young age of 15. Her husband was Gil Taylor, a young Army sergeant. And Pat started her adult life as a military wife.
Yeah, now, that was a family pattern. Pat's mother had her when she was 15.
Oh, okay.
And Pat's daughter, oldest daughter, also had a child at 15, got married at 15. So this was
young.
A family
even for
pattern.
Back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was the pattern.
Okay, so it wasn't that shocking that she did that.
No, it might be shocking to us. Maybe not shocking is the right word.
No, not shocked, but I disapprove.
Okay.
Let's just say that.
Well, we'll just say that 15 is a pretty young age to be married.
Yeah, it's not what I recommend for others.
No.
No, not that people care what I think, but that's what I think. So soon she had 3 children, right in a row, Susan, Debbie, and Ronnie. But motherhood wasn't what she expected it to be. She had an immature mind still, of course. She discovered that she didn't want all the hard work that came along with this life. The lifestyle in the military didn't match up with her dreams of having a large Southern family and raising horses. So Pat asked her parents to help her. Pat moved to be living near or with her parents at some times, having her mother help her out with the kids. And Gil was often off on deployments. The marriage started falling apart in irreparable ways after that, and in 1971, they divorced. Now, what I thought from this is that a lot of it was because she wouldn't move with him like most wives do.
No, she stayed close to Mom.
Yeah.
And actually, the parents sometimes moved themselves to be close to Pat.
Oh, she was spoiled.
Yeah. So she always had her mom. But yeah, she went hardly ever on his deployments.
Still, they were together 10 or 11 years.
Right.
Yeah. Well, she'd known Tom for years before she really noticed him. So Tom Allanson.
That guy.
Yeah. And her whole family, her parents, her children, Susan, Deborah, and Ronnie, as well as Pat herself, were deeply involved in the horse show world of Atlanta. The Radcliffe stables housed some of the area's finest horses. Pat, who was living with her parents, taught riding to exclusive clientele, and both of her daughters were champion equestrians. Tom Allanson had worked with their horses and sold them feed back when he was employed by Ralston Purina. Tom was kind of a disappointment. He was the son of an attorney, and he'd set out to be a veterinarian. But he'd never reached that goal. He'd been a friend to Pat's family. They thought he was a nice guy. But as Pat was watching him work, shirtless and sweaty and muscular, she became really attracted to him.
Well, in a superficial way.
Yes, sexually.
Yes.
So shoeing the Radcliffe's Morgan horses, he just seemed like a big, strong guy. He could lift the hooves, no problem. He had no fear of the horses. And she decided he was everything she ever wanted in a man because he was strong and handsome and a Southern gentleman. So she set her sights on him.
Right. So she's going to be on her plantation.
Yes, that's her Rhett Butler.
Now, in the fall of 1973, Tom was in the process of divorcing his second wife, and he needed a temporary place to live. And it just so happened that the Radcliffes had plenty of room at their horse farm, which was south of Atlanta, and they invited him to stay there. He could sleep on the sofa in their den, and they could use his help with their horses. So it was kind of a mutual agreement.
Yeah, helping each other out.
Yeah.
But to Tom, pairing up with Pat in a romantic way seemed like fate, and they soon spent every waking moment together before he was even divorced. He loved everything about her, and she continually surprised him. He knew almost nothing of her life before he met her, and he didn't care. He didn't ask any questions. But she was very curious about his family. She wanted to know everything about the women he'd been with, and she was just very insecure and demanding and possessive. But in spite of the fact that Tom was still married, they had a very romantic courtship. Tom couldn't believe how lucky he was. He was amazed that Pat loved him back. His biggest fear was that her health would completely break down and he would lose her, because she was always complaining of something.
She had illnesses, and she was prone to what I call the vapors,
Yes.
where she'd just faint.
Well, she's a frail woman.
Yes.
She had fainting spells, was actually hospitalized for them. And he would be crushed by it. He was really, I guess he took it more seriously than I would, because I'm always skeptical.
Well,
But he was really...
You're skeptical because these spells always occurred at times of stress
Yes.
for Pat.
Well, they
So
couldn't be stress-related spells.
Well, it's
Is that
like...
fictional?
Probably. But it's like she was using these as a way of avoiding certain situations.
Right.
But
Yes.
he didn't see that.
No, he's in love with her. So he's, how love is blind. They say that.
I've heard that.
So people would see him standing helplessly at her bedside with her pale little hand in his huge calloused fist. And he laid roses on her pillow and stayed at her bedside with teary eyes. Now Pat tried to send him away, saying to Tom that she was no good for him and he deserved a whole woman. Of course, I think this was just a ploy to get him to say, "Oh, no, of course I want you." But she begged him to face the truth. "You don't want me, Tom," she sobbed. "I can never give you children. I've had a hysterectomy. I'm just an old woman with a scar down my stomach. Nobody would want me." But this only made Tom love her more. He felt like he was saving her. He didn't need more children anyway. He and Pat could raise his 2 children, and of course her son Ronnie was a teenager, so he was still at home.
Right. Her 2 daughters were out of the house at that point.
Yeah, they got out quick.
Yeah.
So Pat and her family became Tom's world. They'd given him a place to live and accepted him, and he pleaded with Pat to marry him as soon as his divorce was final. Pat couldn't take any stress or dissension or disappointments. When Tom listened to her talk about what she wanted in life, he realized that what she wanted in this world really wasn't that much. She just wanted so badly to have the perfect old-fashioned Southern life. So he promised her he would do whatever he could to make her life happy and peaceful so that she could be healthy. So he wanted to make her dreams come true.
He did. And Pat had one dream.
Well,
She wanted to live on her own plantation.
right.
Now, more than a century had passed since the Civil War, but Pat wanted the life of a Southern belle, as she had read about in Margaret Mitchell's novel Gone with the Wind. She wanted her own personal Tara. She wanted to be Scarlett O'Hara. Somehow, someday, she believed Tom was going to get her her own place, a parcel of land where she could hold her head up proudly and live the dream.
Yeah, but Tom wasn't made of money.
No,
He worked hard, but he,
neither of them. I mean, they came from some wealth, but,
Yeah, but
but
neither-
not super rich or anything like that.
No, and neither of them really accomplished much.
And yeah, he graduated college, but
He did.
worked as a farrier.
Yeah.
And,
Which there's nothing wrong with that, but she
No,
wants kind of this
but-
elaborate lifestyle.
but you ain't going to buy a plantation on a horseshoer's salary.
No, and the whole idea of owning a plantation seems really racist to me, because that whole time period was horrible for African Americans. And I just feel like wanting a plantation, it's kind of like wanting to have the old flag hanging at your house. It's not a great thing. Turns me off, really. But she said to Tom, "I'm a rose, Tom, and like a rose, I'm selfish. I want all the sun for myself, all the rain. Roses need everything so they can bloom and be beautiful." But Tom didn't see her as selfish. He admired how she knew what she wanted and how she would ask for it. So he wanted to be with her.
Yeah, now that October, this is still 1973, they found a place that was just right for them. Pat had been feeling strong and healthy, so she had gone deer hunting with Tom. Now, Tom's pretty proud of his girlfriend. She's not his wife yet. She knew more about guns than most men. She tramped through the woods with him, cooked over a campfire, took care of her own gun. Pat had Tom buy her a .44 carbine so she could go deer hunting with him. Now it seemed to Tom that she could do just about anything. So he's already on that slippery slope.
Oh, absolutely. But doesn't it kind of surprise you that she did that when she's supposed to be like this fainting little willow of a woman?
Well, yeah, those are out of character with each other.
Right. So
But
it makes you wonder.
she's doing this just because that's Tom's interest.
But they're just a few months into this relationship.
Yeah.
So they're still in the throes of passion and lust. And they're out camping, they're cuddling, and they had a lot of passionate sex, Tom would say. And Tom wasn't used to a woman being as interested in sex as Pat was. He felt attractive and appreciated when he was with Pat. So they'd found their house, a red brick house with a porch all around it, in Zebulon during their hunting trip. There was a for sale sign on it, and they learned it was the old Hoyt Waller place, and that Waller was selling it because he was divesting himself of some of his real estate holdings. After Pat pointed out the huge potential of this big farm and what they could do with it, she got Tom as excited as she was about buying it. The place was right on Highway 19, just a few miles north of Zebulon. So its 400 feet of road frontage was fenced in with freshly painted white fencing, and there were pine trees beyond the roadside meadow. They had a big curving driveway between these tall Georgia holly bushes all the way around to this brick house and the barn. So it was lovely.
Yes, it was. It was a beautiful home. This is a brick ranch-style house. There's a 25-acre pecan grove, plus another 27 acres. It had been beautifully landscaped with orchards, gardens, and vineyards. There were apple trees, pecan trees, pear trees, grapes. Plus Pat would now have the rose garden she'd always wanted.
Yeah, all they had to do was figure out a way to buy this place.
Minor detail.
And there was money in Tom's family. His father was a successful East Point attorney who had made a lot of money in land. But
Right.
Tom knew his father wasn't going to help him out.
No, he and his father did not get along. So Tom couldn't even remember the last time he had done anything his parents approved of. And they were still quite angry about his upcoming divorce, his second divorce. So he knew there was no point in even asking them for money. Now, at the same time, it seemed that his father enjoyed watching him fail. Tom was the last of 3 Walter Allansons. Old Pa, Walter Allanson, was the first, and then Tom's father was Walter O'Neill Allanson, and then there's Tom himself, whose given names were Seaborn Walter Thomas Allanson, or Tommy. Now, the grandparents, Pa and Nana, were in their 70s, but they had always been more like his parents than Walter and Caroline ever were. Pa still farmed his place in East Point. He had made a small fortune over the years, and he was extremely frugal. But he wasn't stingy and angry the way his father, Tom's father, was. And he'd always been kind to Tom.
So Tom was able to work out a plan with his grandfather. Pa would give Tom the money for 25 acres, and that money would serve as a down payment for the whole place. Tom promised to find a way to make the balloon payments due later. Tom said he would like either to build or move a house onto that acreage for his grandparents. And that sounded good to Pa. Since Nona had suffered a stroke, Pa had been doing both the outside chores and the inside work. He took good care of his wife, but it would be nice to have a woman around to help him, he thought, and cook some meals, do things around the house. Tom assured Pa, I always feel like I'm on Little House on the Prairie when I say Pa.
I know.
But Tom assured Pa that Pat already loved both him and Nona, and he told her how good they had always been to him. So he's thinking he's happy. He's going to have his nice grandparents around. He's got the woman he wants. Tom's pretty hopeful about the future. When Tom first introduced Pat to his grandparents, he left her chatting with Nona while he and Pa went out walking the farm to discuss business. Pa and Nona were polite to Pat, but they were a little surprised to see Tommy with his third woman in just 8 years. And she was obviously older than Tommy by a few years. Nona was surprised when Pat told her that she had 3 children and that both of her daughters had already left home and gotten married. Now Nona, whose speech was compromised by the stroke and who was too polite to speak what was on her mind anyway, listened as Pat went on telling her about her big plans with Tommy. So she doesn't say much, she just hears all this, because Pat likes to talk about herself. And despite Nona's misgivings, she did like Pat. She found her likable. And meanwhile, Tom was explaining to Pa about the place he wanted to buy, And it was a buy that Tom just couldn't walk away from, he said. And so he consulted Pa, and they made that agreement.
So at the same time, Pat's parents, Colonel and Mrs. Radcliffe, were able to help Pat and Tom with the down payment on the Zebulon property. Now, their only request was that they call their farm Kentwood, in memory of Pat's brother, Kent, who had died when he was in his 20s. Killed himself.
He did. Very sad.
Pat would have preferred something more romantic like Rose Hill Farm or Tara Orchards, but they agreed to call it Kentwood Morgan Farm. So at last, Pat had her man and her land. They would make it a showplace where they could host big riding competitions. Tom could shoe horses, she could teach riding lessons. So they moved onto the property in late 1973, and Tom immediately began to work on the place while he waited for his divorce from his second wife to go through. And as soon as he was free, he was going to marry Pat.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Pat wasn't handy at home, so Tom did most of the work. Of course, he didn't mind. He was happy just to be with her and to have Kentwood there for him to live in and take care of. So Ronnie, Pat's son, was 15, and he moved in with his mother and Tom. Pat loved her son, and she indulged him quite a bit. She bought him anything he wanted, and she let him miss a lot of school, which wasn't very smart. She wouldn't push him to go if he skipped school. So he was spoiled but neglected at the same time, like a really bad combination.
Well, that's how she was raised.
True. Good point.
So she doesn't have any other point of reference.
No, she's doing what she knows, I guess.
Yep. So when Tom would try to tell Pat that the boy needed discipline so that he would grow into a good man, Pat reminded him that Ronnie was her child and she knew what was best for him. Now, Ronnie adored his mother, and there were no lengths to which he wouldn't go to please her. But at the same time, would get into trouble fairly often, getting drunk, wrecking cars, buying and selling small amounts of drugs, just your minor teenage things.
When you get to the buying and selling drugs and wrecking cars, I don't know. A little beyond your normal teenage stuff.
Just a bit. Now, if Pat was hurting and needed pain medication, which was not an infrequent thing,
no.
Ronnie would always find a way to get some Demerol for her.
I mean, there is some thought that she was probably addicted, at least for some time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think more than a thought.
Because she was actually giving herself shots.
Now, if someone hurt her feelings or disrespected Pat, Ronnie was okay with threatening people or getting into fights over his mom.
He certainly was. On Christmas Day 1973, Tom was injured when he went to take a big gelding out of the barn and it came running out at him full speed. So he held on to the horse, but his weight didn't stop the horse and it dragged him along, and he ended up fracturing his right collarbone. So for a blacksmith, this is a really bad injury and he couldn't work at all.
Tough to hoof a horse, pounding nails if you have a broken clavicle.
Yes, collarbone.
Thank you.
Well, not everybody knows it's a clavicle.
Okay.
Yeah. So Pat was extremely jealous of Tom's wife, who everybody called Little Carolyn. So even though he's left her and he's with Pat, she's still jealous. And Tom's mother's name was Carolyn, too, so Tom's mother was Big Carolyn, and Tom's second wife was Little Carolyn. So Tom's parents had really taken to her, and she was part of the family to them. They actually liked her more than they liked their own son. But Tom was actually kind of proud that Pat was so jealous of him, like he didn't know better to know that this was a bad sign, because she had no reason to be jealous. Little Carolyn was a pretty woman, but to Tom, she was nothing compared to Pat, and he really just couldn't wait to get divorced. But Pat, she refused to have anything around her that might remind Tom of Little Carolyn. Tom said, "I remember I came home once and something came flying out the door and shattered on the sidewalk. Turns out it was a brand new JCPenney's radio. It had been in my bedroom and it belonged to me, but as far as Pat was concerned, it belonged to Carolyn, and she wasn't having anything of Carolyn in the house. She just threw it all out. She hated Carolyn so bad she even tried to say once that my children weren't mine, that they were my father's children, and that Carolyn and Tom's father had had an affair while they were married."
Which is, of course, a baseless argument.
It is, but it just shows what a sick person Pat was.
Yeah, doesn't it?
Yeah. Because she didn't even like to have pictures of the kids around, right?
Right. Tom didn't believe what Pat was saying about his kids, because she often talked about bringing Russ and Sherry to live with them, and how she would be their new mother. But at the same time, she wouldn't allow Tom to show any pictures or have anything on display of his kids in her house.
That's terrible.
Yeah, so, she says one thing and acts another way.
Yeah. She's messed up.
She is.
Yeah.
Now, the divorce from little Carolyn was dragging on, and Pat was getting increasingly frustrated over it. She wanted to be married to Tom and not just living with him. Then a divorce hearing in early spring of 1974 ended in another postponement. And after realizing that Tom and little Carolyn were very far apart on monetary agreement, the judge wouldn't grant the divorce.
Yeah, and after that hearing, Pat turned white and dug her fingernails into Tom's arm. She made it out of the courthouse, but as soon as they were on the front lawn, she fell over. Someone screamed and the paramedics were called.
Boom.
So Pat had one of her feigning spells.
She had a spell.
So gradually she came to, and Tom took her home. No hospitalization required that time. His divorce went through soon, though, in May. And Tom and Pat went to a Morgan horse show in Stone Mountain, Georgia that same evening. Pat had decided that they would go to Stone Mountain as Scarlett and Rhett, and she spent hours making costumes for them. She was very proud of her talent as a seamstress. She'd chosen royal blue as the Kentwood Morgan Farm's show colors, and their chairs, tents, and blankets all matched in that color blue. Pat's gown was white with a sweetheart neckline, puffed sleeves, and a big hoop skirt, so it was way over the top. She wore white gloves, white feathers in her hair, and her favorite cameo around her neck. Tom felt a little foolish dressed up when he saw what he had to wear, but he wore it for her sake.
Yes, she even had a fake mustache for him to stick on.
I know, this isn't a dress-up party. It's kind of weird that they did this.
Well, it's so Pat can be the center of attention.
Yeah, but they looked like they came from another time, like they came through a time machine.
Yeah, we saw pictures of that.
And Pat was just thrilled because they were Scarlett and Rhett, and they got all kinds of attention. And they were both just thrilled about Tom's divorce being granted that day. So when they did have their wedding, it made headlines. And I'm sure that Pat was behind that. A reporter for the Griffin Daily News wrote that Pat and Tom had not only met cute, but they'd married cute. So under the headline, "They were determined to get married," a 3-column spread described their wedding. Pat Radcliffe and Tom Allanson had an unusual wedding, to say the least. Pat had explained to the reporter that she and Tom had known each other for 15 years, ever since the day she had called Tom as a last-minute replacement for her regular blacksmith. They had not gotten along at all, Pat laughed, since she was a specialist in Morgan horses and Tom preferred quarter horses. However, she said she'd won him over. When Pat had been stricken and confined to bed, Tom became a regular caller, the reporter wrote, and from that came wedding bells. And Tom said to the reporter, "She moves about so much that it was the first time I had to catch her."
Yeah, now this future story failed to mention that their divorce had just been granted that very same day that they got married.
Yeah.
It also didn't mention any of the other marriages for either the bride or the groom. Only thing the article featured on was the romantic and chaotic details of their day, and it was quite a day.
Yeah, well, they'd reserved the chapel for a 2 p.m. wedding and rented a motel room for the night. And Tom was taking a van loaded with horses to the show, and he had a tire blowout. So he was stranded on a busy interstate near Atlanta, and he made his way to a service station. And then someone passing by knew where he could get tires for his van. So Pat was waiting at the chapel when he arrived, and he sent word that he'd run into trouble and would be late. By the time word reached Pat, she already had guessed that something had gone wrong and canceled the ceremony. But when Tom finally got the van repaired and got to the horse show, word spread among show people what had happened, and they suggested that the show tents were already beautifully decorated and that one of them should be used for the wedding. So a Baptist minister was called, and he said that in all his years in the ministry, he'd never been called on to perform a wedding ceremony under these type of circumstances. So with all these show people looking on in one of the tents, Tom and Pat pledged their love to each other. And Pat got all the attention she was craving.
Yeah, it was a good day for her, wasn't it?
She loved it.
She was dressed up as the Southern Belle, marrying the man of her dreams, living on her plantation.
That's right. Yep.
So Pat did manage to get in several plugs for her new Kentwood riding facilities and mentioned that she would continue teaching riding at Woodward Academy. And the picture accompanying the piece was, of course, perfect for the story. Pat and Tom, as Scarlett and Rhett, smiled for the camera, a lovely, slender woman with feathers in her hair and an ivory fan open in her small gloved hands, the huge man next to her with a big grin.
Yeah, so Pat's family was pleased with her marriage to Tom, and Tom's grandparents thought that Pat was a really sweet, thoughtful woman, but his parents were totally another story.
Well, at least his father.
Well, Big Carolyn went along with it.
Well, yeah, she was kind of an abused wife in that
Sounds
respect.
like it. She sounds like a battered woman.
She did everything that her husband told her to do.
He did seem like a mean guy.
He's a prick.
So Walter and Big Carolyn Allanson wanted nothing to do with Tom's third wife, Pat. They had completely sided with little Carolyn during the divorce, and any efforts that he made to see his kids and to show his parents what a great woman Pat was were just rejected. So hoping to ease the situation a little, Marguerite Radcliffe, Pat's mom, reached out to the Allansons. She called and invited them to join her and Colonel Radcliffe for dinner at the Officers' Club at Fort McPherson, but they said they were not interested. They didn't even want to get to know Pat's parents. Even though they were very proper people, there was nothing to make them not like them, except their daughter.
Right.
Right.
I mean, these were upstanding members of their community.
Yeah, Marguerite prided herself on being well-mannered and someone of society.
Right.
And she was shocked to find people be so outright rude to her. That's just not the way they did it in her society.
No, it wasn't.
But then Tom lost his job at Ralston Purina.
Yeah, and he suspected that it was father's interfering that caused it. Now, there's absolutely no evidence for that.
No, but I think Pat tried to make him think that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the evidence
She
for
was
it.
egging him on.
Right. It was Pat. And he did try to make up for his lost salary with his blacksmith work, but that caused a bit of a problem in his relationship with Pat. So Tom found out, to his surprise, that his bride was not only jealous of his ex-wife, she was jealous of any woman who looked at him. She didn't want him around other women unless she was with him. Now, Tom tried to explain to her that horse barns were not exactly prime spots to find other women.
Yeah.
Right?
I wouldn't think so.
And that he spent 95% of his life around men, but it didn't help. Pat insisted on accompanying Tom on his rounds. He was proud of her, but at the same time, she would put a damper on any male conversation. Instead of chatting easily with the guys who hung around as he shod horses, Tom wondered whether Pat was uncomfortable and feeling okay. And her presence made his customers feel uncomfortable also. So we have a little bit of a problem here. But Tom loved Pat too much to complain and risk hurting her feelings, and he would never tell her to stay home.
Yeah, but it's just not constructive as well as obsessive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like she's stalking, almost.
Yeah.
You know?
So she did give a few horseback lessons, and they sometimes rented their surrey or the sulky and their horses for shows and for parades. She and Tom went to horse shows, but they both soon realized that they would have to budget really tightly and work harder if they were going to make Kentwood the place they'd planned for it to be. Pat wanted everything immediately, though, and Tom kept having to explain to her that he just couldn't afford it. Without his job at Ralston Purina, and with the broken collarbone that kept him from shoeing horses for a couple of months, he was really suffering financially. Now he could work, but his blacksmith business was actually going downhill because of Pat's insistence that she always be present, or because he had to drop everything sometimes and rush home when she had a spell of fainting. So that's not helping his business at all. Nobody wants a horseshoer who's going to have to take his fainting wife home. In
Right.
the middle, get one shoe on
got
and
a
then
shoe
you're out.
on and boom, you're gone. I'll be right back.
You're going to have lopsided horses.
Yeah. Because Tom could never tell when Pat was going to faint.
No, it was random.
Sometimes she would be driving their Jeep around the place and she'd just faint at the wheel and fall out the driver's door. Sometimes he would race home to find her lying by the telephone.
Jeez.
So it was impossible for Pat to work full-time because who knows when these are going to happen.
So do you think she had Munchausen?
Oh, yeah.
She really seems to be making herself sick.
So and Tom wasn't even sure that Pat should be giving riding lessons if she's going to be fainting. You don't want her falling off the horse.
It's true. Tom wanted to get his grandparents moved on to the place too, and he'd promised them that he would do that. But even with the worries about money and feuds with his parents, Tom was pretty happy during this time. So he and Pat called each other Sugar, and eventually that was abbreviated to Shug, which the only time I've heard that before is on The King of the Hill. I love you, Shug, but maybe that's something they do down south.
I think it's a southern expression.
Yeah. They had special songs and little sayings that were just for them to know about. Like their little saying was, "First things first, Shug." And they would see to what was important, and the rest of the plans would fall in line, was what this meant. But you could see that to other people it was a little sickening.
Yeah,
A little.
maybe not sickening, but just
It's just a little over the top, you know?
quite a bit.
Yeah. It just seemed kind of phony and over the top. But things were really bad with his parents, and that was for real, especially his father. Walter Allanson could have a really crude mouth, and he used it to talk about Pat. So although he'd never even met her, he hated her. When Tom was first living with Pat, he'd told his son that she was a slut, a woman whose bad reputation was common knowledge, and he actually said she'll lie down with any man with a truck and a horse trailer. So you could see that Tom would be really insulted by that statement. But it turns out that Pat had had many affairs that were no secret in town, and Walter Allanson was pointing that out to his son to try and persuade him not to go with her. If Tom had anything to do with her, he was a bigger idiot than he already proved he was what Walter said. But Tom was standing by Pat, of course. He was in love with her. And it wasn't the first time that his father had been a real dick. I mean, that was his father's way. He just liked to ruin things for Tom, it seemed. And he felt like if Pat knew what my father's saying about her, she'd be really heartbroken. So he sheltered her from that and didn't tell her. It was difficult for him, though, because Pat kept urging him to make peace with his family. She suspected that there was money in Tom's family, and she thought that they should have access to that.
Well, yeah, that's why she wanted him to make peace with him.
Yes, right.
Right? Because as long as they're feuding, ain't no money coming their way.
Right, so she doesn't understand what's going on here. Tom had told her that Pa was shrewd and had hidden money stashes all over his place that was out on Washington Road. And the way Pat understood it, Pa had sold the back part of his land to Tom's father, and then Walter had gotten it zoned for multi-dwellings and sold it to builders to put up apartment complexes. So he would have made a lot of money from that.
Quite a bit, yeah. Tom was the Allansons' only son, and Pa and Nana's favorite grandson. And eventually, Pat figured, it would all belong to them. They were never going to make Kentwood what it should be if Tom didn't get his inheritance. Now that she and Tom were married, she was sure Walter and Big Carolyn would accept her.
She's wrong.
She's wrong. She came from Silers on her mother's side, a fine old Southern family. She had parents to be proud of. Her papa was, after all, a retired colonel, and Pat considered herself far superior to Tom's ex-wife. She was a lady whose children were riding champions, a lady who had met Governor Jimmy Carter and the Japanese royal family personally, and she felt sure that the Allansons would realize that and be grateful that she had married their son.
But Tom knew better. He wasn't optimistic that would ever happen. He knew exactly how his father could be, but it was impossible for him to explain to Pat why they couldn't be friendly with his parents. He was learning that Pat had a way of really aggravating people. She would speak without thinking, and she would often say the wrong thing. Also, seeing Pat through his father's eyes made him shudder. She showed way too much leg, she showed a lot of cleavage, so the sight of her would give his dad more ammunition to talk against her. But at the same time, he couldn't tell Pat to dress differently. He didn't want to hurt her feelings. And now that he was married to her, he saw that Pat was even more sensitive than he'd realized, and he really felt like he needed to protect her. Pat's grandmother Siler had died the spring they married, and the family got together in North Carolina to bury her. Most of them met Tom for the first time then. There was a big ruckus as the funeral procession was organized, though. Pat had a fit because she thought that their car should be first in the procession. Now Tom was really fascinated to see the way that the Silers all moved aside and listened to whatever Pat told them to do. She explained to Tom how special she had always been to her grandmother, and he could see that they all loved Pat. Everybody seemed to love Pat, everyone except his parents. So Pat realized that her in-laws wanted nothing to do with her, and she was very hurt and angry about this. Why did Walter and Big Carolyn have to be so petty, she thought. So their non-existent relationship with his parents was a constant problem with Pat. She complained about it constantly. She complained about his ex-wife, little Carolyn, and she insisted that they were somehow responsible for Tom's losing his job at Ralston Purina. Pat felt that Walter was making it his life's mission to see that Tom never had a job again. He had several applications out for jobs, she said, but his father would always manage to mess it up for him. Tom wanted to be on the mounted patrol, and his father stopped that too, she said.
A little bit of paranoia there, huh?
Yeah, And she is on drugs, so that could be part of that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Still, Walter Allison would not accept Tom's divorce and his remarriage. But Tom was realizing that his new wife was no peacemaker either. She would always be on his side, and that was good, but she talked too much, and her comments would get back to his father and make things even worse.
Yeah, so just after they got married, in the summer of 1974, Pat Allanson was on fire. There was a side to her personality that Tom had never seen before. So instead of being content that she and Tom were finally man and wife and letting the rest of the world go by, she nagged at him constantly to do something about his father. "You call yourself a man?" she taunted Tom. "If you were a man, you wouldn't let him treat you like he does." It tore him up to see Pat cry, but he had never been able to win with his father. He had no idea what Pat expected him to do. He's trying to just do his own thing. He knows for sure that there's never going to be any reconciliation with his father.
Right, he's trying to make it on his own. But that's not good enough for her.
No, she seemed to be in his face whichever way he turned, and he just couldn't make her see that they didn't need his father or his father's money. Pat, on her hand, wanted Tom to work things out with his parents, and she demanded to be welcomed into his family. They were insulting her and embarrassing her, not to mention her parents. Now, any husband who truly cared for her wouldn't stand still for such treatment. So here we are, maybe a month into the marriage. Things are getting pretty bad.
Now, when you're telling me all that, I'm thinking, oh, they must have been married a couple of years.
Right.
At least, you know. But a month in and this is happening?
They fit a lot of living into their short marriage.
Jeez, yeah, so that's really bad. So she's already like 30 days into the marriage and she's withdrawing from Tom. The newlyweds already had 15-year-old Ronnie living with them, and now Pat started asking her daughters, Susan and Deborah, and other relatives to visit and stay overnight. Pat's daughters and relatives were noticing that Pat was avoiding being alone with her husband Tom, and this struck them as really odd since she and Tom were still on their honeymoon basically. And she seemed really heartbroken. Her family knew that she always needed emotional support and attention, and Tom's parents' rejection had really had an effect on her and made her bitter. The situation only grew worse when Pat's mother, Marguerite, received an unexpected phone call at the office of the children's dentist where she worked. And this was from Walter Allanson, Tom's dad. And he called her and said, "Tell him to do the right thing," pretty much telling her to tell Tom to get away from Pat. Seemed to be what he was trying to do. But now in Marguerite's eyes, Pat could do no wrong. And then Marguerite later described this strange conversation she had with Walter. He told me that Tommy had come into his ex-wife's apartment and put formaldehyde in some milk. "Did you call the police?" she'd asked him. And he said that he did, and they tested it and found out that it was formaldehyde. So he said he was sure that Tom did it, and Marguerite was just appalled by this statement. It didn't make any sense. Why would Tom want to hurt his children? He loved his children. He'd never have harmed them. So of course she told her daughter Pat about this call, and when Pat heard about what Walter had said, she totally freaked out and started yelling and screaming at Tom. So just a big mess very early on in this marriage. Marguerite went to Walter's office to try and talk some sense into him, but he was very adamant that his son had tried to poison his own children. He also said that Tom had broken in and stolen 3 of his guns. He said he no longer had a son, and he expected the guns to be returned to him in the mail.
Yep, things are going downhill here in this relationship, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Now, Pat's daughter, Susan, who was 21 that summer, often came out to Kentwood with her baby son, Sean. Susan had always been able to read her mother's moods, and she saw that Pat was strung out. She constantly picked at Tom for having no backbone, and she demanded that he defend her honor, go to his parents, and force them to welcome her into the family circle as his wife. Susan saw that Tom was so completely in love with Pat that he would do anything to please her. But Tom knew he had no power at all with his father.
Yeah, so there was this one episode in June where Pat was alone at Kentwood, and Tom had been going over to Barnesville to shoe horses, and for some reason she didn't go with him that day. Ronnie had said he would be in Zebulon on a painting job. So it was a sunny day, and Pat said she was feeling well enough to do a little work around the farm. She got out the riding mower to cut the grass. In a statement she later gave to the Pike County deputy, she described something terrifying that had happened that afternoon. She said she was all by herself in the great big yard, and she was cutting way up the front part of the road, which is a long way from the house. She said she was just nonchalantly cutting the grass, and she saw a truck go by. She said it looked like our truck, a blue camper truck. So she knew it wasn't hers, though, because the camper top was off. So she went around and saw a big, tall hedgerow about 14 feet high between her farm and the field, and she could see the top of the camper. So she thought, well, gosh, that must be somebody having trouble with their truck. But then, she said, there he stood, sleeves rolled up, and he dropped his pants. I didn't know what to do. She said she slammed on the brakes on the tractor and was just frozen. She told the deputy that she recognized this man who exposed himself to her out in the field. She had seen him for years around East Point, and lately his picture had been in all the papers and on political signs, even though she'd never personally met him. But this was Walter Allanson, she said, her husband's father, standing out there showing his penis to her in the middle of the day. But she hadn't called the sheriff first, she'd called Tom, and she was in a real panic, so he could barely understand her. But then she blurted out to him that his father had stood right out in their hedgerow and exposed his penis to her. So Tom was really shocked and told her to call the sheriff right away. A Pike County's sheriff deputy raced the 2.5 miles from the courthouse to Kentwood, and he found a hysterical Pat standing at the kitchen phone holding a .22 rifle. The Pike County deputy managed to calm Pat down and suggested that she talk with her husband about whether they wanted to bring charges against his father. Now Pat seemed composed enough when he had to leave on another call.
This was actually the second visit for the police to Kentwood Morgan Farm. In early April, Tom Allanson had called to report that somebody had shot one of his cars full of .22 bullet holes. The car was parked out in back of the barn, and it looked like it had been used for target practice. Now, the police had never been able to pin the shooting on a suspect, and Tom didn't have any suggestions. A lot of people coming and going at Kentwood. And then, of course, we have the 15-year-old stepson, Ronnie, living there. And also from time to time some teenage friends of his. But this time, a suspect had been positively identified. And that's his father. When Tom got home a few minutes after police left, he listened in shock to Pat's accusations against his father. Now, his father was a mean SOB, but Tom couldn't even begin to imagine him as a flasher. Father was too controlled to do such a thing, or it always seemed that way to Tom. And you got to look at this story with a little bit of incredulity.
Sure.
I mean, this is an attorney who's running for public office.
And very uptight, right-wing Christian guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's not going to go flash his daughter-in-law.
He doesn't even consider her his daughter-in-law.
Right.
I mean, he did hate her, so I guess it would be possible. But people that knew the guy thought that was very unlike him. But, Tom thought it over, and he said, his dad had done other things to make their lives miserable, so I guess it was possible. After all, he'd told Pat's mother, Marguerite, that his father didn't care if Tom lived or died. So his father had accused him of putting poison in his own children's milk and of stealing guns from him. And Pat believed his father had ruined him in the job market and would eventually kill him if he got the chance. Even Nana and Pa had warned Tom that Walter might be a danger. But this was just unforgivable in Tom's eyes. Walter, the attorney, the candidate for judge, had exposed himself to Tom's wife, and that enraged Tom. So as much as he dreaded the prospect, he knew that he would have to confront his father. Now, Walter O'Neill Allanson and his wife Carolyn were both 51 in June of 1974, and they had been married for 32 years. They appeared to have a comfortable marriage, although some said that Walter had strayed a bit in his 40s. But if he had, Carolyn had let it go and they'd gotten past it. And in his 50s, Walter had grown almost Puritan in his opinions about the sanctity of marriage, especially if there were children involved. He was totally inflexible against divorce.
Yeah, and his view of life had cost him his relationship with his own sister, Jean. Even though she and her husband lived only a few blocks away, they virtually had nothing to do with Walter and Caroline. And now his rigid moral views had shut his son Tom out also. So here's an incident in late June of 1974. Carolyn and Walter left their house a little after 9 in the morning, driving their 1963 white Ford station wagon. Walter wanted to check on one of his real estate purchases, so they were heading north of Atlanta to the Lake Lanier area. As he drove the station wagon and headed up Truman Mountain Road, Walter lit a cigarette and turned to say something to his wife, when suddenly shots came out, without warning, somewhere in the woods up the 6-foot bank to their right. Walter and Caroline were caught in their fishbowl of station wagon windows. The wagon was hit several times. Walter felt a trickle of blood on his face. The windshield was spider-webbed in front of Caroline and in front of him. Now, altogether, the station wagon had been hit 9 times, and officers retrieved 4 bullet fragments from inside the car. Back up toward the lake, the sheriff and his men located an area that was carefully prepared as an ambush site. Branches had been cut off of a pine tree and arranged as a shield to hide the shooter from the road. There was a beer can on the ground with a half-inch of beer, still cool, and 6.22 caliber bullet cases. Investigators detected a trail through the woods that led back to Highway 53, and they found faint tracks in the dirt shoulder of the highway, indicating that a large vehicle had been parked there recently. So someone had apparently waited quietly for the station wagon to head up Truman Morton Road. Space between the severed tree limbs had given the shooter a perfect straight arrow look down the road. Now, it would seem to me, because we're going to be accusing people of doing this, right?
They will, yes.
They will.
Mm-hmm.
He'd have to know their schedule.
Yes. He'd have to kind of be stalking them, I guess.
Yeah, now how's that going to happen?
Well, I don't know. Somebody had to do it, though.
Yeah.
Okay, so
somebody had to
who are
do
you
it.
suggesting did it?
Well, I'm just suggesting that it's tough to just assume that your estranged son did it.
Yeah, but there's assuming on both sides. They're assuming that his father made him lose his job, that he's making
Yeah,
it impossible
no,
for him to get a job.
I know that.
So it's going back and forth. And there probably is some truth to it. If it isn't their son, it's probably his wife, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Pat and Tom were having dinner that night with the Colonel and Marguerite at their Tell Road Horse Ranch around 6:30. And it was there that they received the message that Nana and Pa had to talk to them. And that was how they learned that someone had shot up Tom's parents' station wagon. And Tom was just wondering why his life was getting more and more bizarre and violent since he'd married Pat. Now, on Monday, July 1st, Pat and Tom appeared at the East Point Police Department, and Pat did most of the talking. She demanded that a warrant be sworn out for the arrest of Walter, charging him with public indecency and threatening phone calls. Tom stood quietly behind her until she completely had a breakdown and started crying, and then he stepped forward. But he didn't know that his father had accused him of the Lake Lanier shooting, and Walter didn't know yet that Pat had accused him of indecent exposure. But just 2 days later, Carolyn and Walter Allanson would be dead. Pat and Tom went into town. We know that Pat was going to a doctor's appointment to have her shoulder x-rayed. Tom was planning to talk to his mother and try and settle things because they were really getting out of control. So that's the initial story. But it would actually take years to get the full story of what happened. And this was still early on, believe it or not, in Pat's criminal career.
Yeah, she's just getting started.
Because she hasn't been arrested for anything.
Nope.
No. So let's take a moment for our sponsor.
Sure. Support for today's show comes from Grove Collaborative. Grove Collaborative makes it easy to discover effective and natural home and personal care products. They select only the best non-toxic products so you can shop with confidence, knowing that everything on their website is good for you, your family, and the planet.
Yeah, I really love how Grove offers us the non-toxic products that we like to use without having to make any commitments. They also have price matching, free shipping, and a 100% happiness guarantee. So you can go ahead and use the product, and if you don't like it, you can send it back. Now, our home really smells fresh and clean without using the chemicals, and I feel good about the products in my cabinets. You know, I used to like the smell of the Murphy's Oil soap or the Lysol, and that's what I associated with clean. But now that I'm using these kinds of products, I'm thinking of fresh mint and more natural things that really make the house smell clean in a more natural and safe way.
Yeah, so I think you're saying that it's not just a chemical aroma that indicates clean.
Right, which
Right?
is something I had to learn because
Yeah.
I grew up with bleach and Pine Sol and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So with their own safe, effective, and affordable Grove flagship products, as well as amazing brands like Method, 7th Generation, Tom's, and Real Simple, Grove distributes some premium quality products that are all natural, beautiful, and sustainable.
Yeah, we've been making the switch to all safe, non-toxic products, both in our home and in my office, a pediatric practice. Grove helps us meet our goals for safe and earth-friendly choices. We've been using method cleaning products and Mrs. Meyer's hand soap, and now with Grove we have a much wider variety of non-toxic personal and household care products to choose from. And even better, Grove guides are always available to answer questions. Grove lets you set a schedule for things you use all the time, so you never run out.
And right now, True Crime Brewery listeners are getting a unique offer and bonus gift from Grove. Go to grove.co/brewery, that's grove.co, not grove.com, and you'll receive a $30 Mrs. Meyer's gift set, plus a bonus gift and a 2-month VIP membership for free with your order of just $20 or more. So that's grove.co, not grove.com/brewery. Grove makes it easy to have a happy, healthy home.
So on the day of the Allanson murders, Tom dropped Pat off at her doctor and then walked over to see his mother because he knew that his father wouldn't be home at that time. So his plan was to talk to his mom and maybe get her to intercede with his father on his behalf.
Makes sense.
It does. I'm thinking they should have thought of that sooner.
But I think it's just impossible for him to talk to his father.
Yeah. Now, Pat had told Tom that someone had been calling their house all night long, hanging up without speaking. Now, she told Tom she was sure it was his father, Walter, doing it. So Tom felt it was time to try to straighten things out. Otherwise, he thought his father might try to shoot him off his horse in the parade that weekend.
And that sounds funny, but he was serious.
Yeah, we're coming up to the 4th of July weekend here, so he was serious. He was actually convinced that he'd be shot off his horse.
Yeah, but Pat's kind of feeding him that paranoia.
Oh, yeah.
And he's soaking it right up.
Now, he went over to his parents' house. His mother wasn't home, but Tom knew she would be returning shortly. So to avoid the possibility of running into Walter, he went into the basement to wait for his mother to return.
So this is just a big disaster.
This starts the downward trend here.
So there's this curious thing that he received a call from an unknown woman, Walter did, at his office, telling him that Tom was at the house. So who would have done that? Who even knew besides Pat?
Well, let's all point fingers at Pat.
Well, it sure seems like it.
Right?
Another thing was the electricity was shut off, and Walter went home and went to the basement to look around. He found the switch box had been tampered with, so he went to call the police, but the phone line had been cut also. So he went to a neighbor's home to use the phone and to get the police out there. But when they arrived, Walter said he'd take care of the situation himself, so the police went ahead and left.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, I know this is like 40 years ago, but that wouldn't happen these days.
No. Well, then Walter went down to the basement and just started shooting randomly.
Well, we heard gunshots were heard, right?
They were heard randomly. Now, Carolyn was home by that time, and he called up to her that he had Tom cornered and needed the gun that he just bought, a new gun. So she grabbed it to bring it to him. So these people are kind of crazy with the guns and stuff.
That's true.
That's really something.
Now, at 8:04 p.m., which is almost exactly an hour after he had first responded to a call from the Allanson residence, Sergeant Callahan's radio crackled and he heard a familiar address. This time the complainant was a neighbor. So when the police officer arrived, they found Carolyn Allanson sitting upright on the basement steps, and she was dead, with a gunshot wound in her chest. Now, through the basement window, they could see Walter was lying on the ground, and he had been shot. Now, the police weren't sure if the shooter was still in the basement, so they shot some tear gas in there. It was hard to see, with tears running down their faces. So the fire department set up a few fans to clear out the cellar and see what they could do, because they didn't flush anyone out.
Nobody came out. Nope.
So they stumbled over lumber and tools, a half-finished boat, a surfboard, a miniature railroad track that had been mounted on a sheet of plywood. They could make out Carolyn's body sitting on the basement steps, and just opposite her, behind the heating system, there was a brick base of a fireplace. It had a large rectangular hole in it, 5 feet high by 3 feet wide, easily large enough for a man to hide in. They had no idea how far back it went. Now, outside the hole, they found a blood-stained flashlight that had been turned off, and a .32 caliber pistol had been wedged between a surfboard and the plywood that held the electric train. Their own flashlights picked up still liquid puddles and droplets of blood on the floor around the hole in the base of the fireplace. Back toward the stairs, they located a rifle and a crowbar near a stack of interior doors.
Well, the uniformed policeman went out on foot to check the neighborhood for the suspect. At that point, they knew only that an older woman was dead on the steps. The young woman on the scene was hysterical and wasn't of much help, and this was little Carolyn. She was the ex-daughter-in-law of Walter and Big Carolyn, of course. And she just repeated over and over that someone had been in the basement and that Daddy Allanson had gone down to get him. She continued to babble on about Daddy and Mother. Daddy had caught someone in the hole, and she had begged Mother Allison not to go down there. Now, almost as an aside, little Carolyn said that she had seen Tom's new wife driving around the block in her blue Jeep. So that was pretty helpful, even though she might not have known it. And beyond that, they really couldn't get much out of her. So the police immediately suspected Tom.
Well, sure.
He'd been seen there, and a man matching his description had been seen running from the crime scene. Officers spotted the blue Jeep they were looking for parked outside an office building just blocks away. They suspected that this was the vehicle Carolyn Allanson had said she'd seen, and there was already a statewide lookout for it, and for its alleged driver, Patricia Taylor Allanson. So a quick radio check with wants and warrants told them that the plate had been issued for a new Jeep purchased 3 months before in Marietta, Georgia, and that it was registered to Patricia R. Taylor of the Kentwood Morgan Farm in Zebulon. So the 3 policemen could make out the form of a woman sitting in the Jeep, but there was no way of knowing if she was alone or if someone was crouching down beside her or behind her. So they leaped from their police unit and approached the Jeep from behind with their guns drawn. The woman in the vehicle didn't move at all, not even turn her head to glance at them, and they yelled, "Get out of the Jeep! Get out of the Jeep with your hands up!" So for a moment there was no movement in the Jeep, and then a tiny woman wearing a mini skirt and a halter top poked one bare leg out, slid it to the ground, and turned to stare at them. She held up one arm and gestured that she could not raise the other because it was injured. So she's a real pathetic sight here.
She is.
So the 2 officers, Callahan and Jones, moved to either side of the woman, who they presumed to be Pat Allanson, and they led her to the police car. Now she didn't resist, but she winced, as if her shoulder was hurting her. And all she said was, "What's going on? What's happened?" And she did ask where Tom was. She told police she'd been waiting for her husband for hours, and she was really worried, so much so that she'd called her parents, the Colonel and Mrs. Radcliffe, to come and be with her. She said she'd be glad to talk with the officers and do whatever they wished, if only she could wait for her mother and Daddy to get there. She appeared pretty panicked, and She appeared panicked that the officers would remove her from the parking lot before her mother arrived. So Captain Lynn got on the radio, and he broadcast a "Be on the lookout" for Tom Allanson, giving the descriptive information on his appearance, and the details fit the running man that an officer had seen just after hearing the report of a burglar in the house at the Allanson home. So the man had been seen running toward an intersection. The blue Jeep that Pat had been in was towed to a city garage, and the detective saw a container of takeout fried chicken in the front seat. And I guess Pat had told them she got hungry while she was looking for him, and she got a bucket of chicken.
Yeah, I believe that's the story. I mean, she's working in her alibi, right?
Yeah. Well, back at the house, they'd completed their search of the basement. Walter Allanson lay on the floor parallel to the steps, and his body had been hidden by the stack of doors. His new rifle was on the floor about 4 feet from his body, and a few feet from the body of his wife. There was no way of telling which of them had fired the rifle, or if either of them had. 1 round had been fired from it, and it was also partially cocked with a live round half in the chamber. Walter Allanson had obvious gunshot wounds in his face, neck, and torso. His blood had left trails of gore over half the basement, particularly near the hole in the base of the fireplace, and then it pooled beneath him as he bled out. The investigators couldn't hope to do a thorough crime scene investigation until daylight, and that was still hours away. The property cordoned off and stationed patrolmen to guard it until morning. They knew what had happened. It would just take them a long, long time before they knew how or why.
Now, Walter Allanson's sister Jean hadn't felt well all that day. She was standing at her stove fixing something to eat around 8:30 in the evening when a neighbor came to the back door and told her that something had happened at her brother's house. So she ran over to the house, and police told her they were looking for Tom as their suspect. Now, Jean didn't believe that Tom would be capable of shooting anybody, much less his parents. And she was the one who had to break the bad news to Walter's parents, Pa and Nana. Pat was interviewed at the police station. She spoke rapidly and breathlessly. beginning with her own numerous physical problems, her sleep deprivation, and Tom's absolute insistence that she see a doctor. She said they had finished shoeing horses in the morning. Then Tom brought her into the house. He took her to Dr. Thompson's office like he always did because she was unable to drive without it hurting her.
But she did drive it.
Yeah, she did, because she could.
Right. Tom walked her to the door around 3:30, she said. She got through at the doctor's and Tom still wasn't in the waiting room, so she went outside and the Jeep was there.
You know, when Tom had left her there, he had walked in the opposite direction toward the CNS Bank, Pat said. He was trying to get an extension on a loan because he'd been having to pay so much alimony and so much in court costs and all, and his father had made him lose a couple of jobs he had, and he had been begging and pleading with his father to leave them alone.
So it seems like she couldn't answer a question without accusing people
Yeah.
of being
And it's
responsible
like
for her problems.
a stream of consciousness,
Yeah,
and she's just blabbing everything.
right. So Pat said she waited and waited for Tom.
Yeah, and it wasn't like him at all not to be there, and she's beginning to get worried about him because of the threats his father had made to him. So the first thing that entered her mind was that just maybe his mother and father had driven by and maybe he was talking to them, or maybe he had gone to talk to them.
Then she really started getting nervous, and the only telephone she knew of, she said, was in the King Professional Building. So that's when she said she got in the Jeep and drove over there.
Yeah, Tom was arrested late that night when he returned to his home. He walked out of his house at 3 a.m. and was taken into custody without incident. Pat immediately retained the services of a local attorney to represent Tom, but soon she insisted on directing Tom's defense. She was taking quite a hands-on approach to this.
Yeah, she was.
And the lawyer just absolutely loathed her.
Yeah, a lot of people did. As Tom was awaiting trial, his bride of only 2 months now, and it seems like it's been years, visited as often as she was allowed.
You know, there's a lot that's happened in those 2 months, right?
I know. Now, during one of those visits, she presented Tom with a Bible, one of only a few books that inmates were allowed to have. But what jail personnel didn't know is that it was a tool being used by Pat to instigate a suicide pact with Tom. So every chance she got, Pat was begging Tom to join her in a suicide so they wouldn't be separated ever again. Now, Tom considered it, and he often thought about it in prison, but he couldn't bring himself to carry it out. Tom had really mixed feelings about his parents' murders. He'd never been close to them, and he would have made a better son for his grandfather than he did for his own father. Pa Allanson had never quite known what to make of his son Walter, who was ambitious and kind of looked at his son Tommy as a liability, because he just wasn't up to snuff of what Walter wanted in a son.
Yeah, you know, he wasn't ever going to be a white-collar lawyer.
Right, any kind of bigwig.
Right.
Or even a veterinarian.
No. Now, Carolyn and Walter had been reluctant parents. They were not at all thrilled when Carolyn became pregnant in 1942. And both Carolyn and Walter were only 19 years old, and he was in the Army Air Corps, serving in World War II. They hadn't planned to have any children, and they decided, after Tommy, to never have another. Carolyn gave birth to Tommy in Ocilla, Georgia, where Pa and Nona lived at the time. He was a pretty big baby.
Yeah, and she would complain about how big he was and how hard the birth was.
Yep.
Walter earned his law degree from Atlanta Law School, and Carolyn worked as a nurse to put him through school. Just when Walter was finally ready to practice on his own, the Korean War came along and he was called up for active duty. He was over 30 before he could really begin his life then. Walter and Carolyn had a lot of catching up to do, they felt. Stubborn was an apt description of Walter Allanson. He would make no excuses or apologies to anyone. And Carolyn kept on working full-time for a doctor in East Point. So things did get gradually better for them. In 1959, Walter moved to a larger suite of offices and continued in law practice. He did well. He wasn't a rich lawyer, but he was making a comfortable living. He also loved boats and liked to fish, but he only liked to do it in solitude. Taking Tommy along was a nuisance. So from young Tommy's viewpoint, his father had been either studying or working his whole life. Walter was a man who seldom showed him any emotion and never showed him any love. Carolyn was warmer, but she deferred to her husband when it came to dealing with Tommy. So it's not surprising that Tommy looked to Pa for the love and attention he didn't get at home. And he would say he spent the happiest days of his childhood on his grandparents' farm. While he was in high school, Tom learned to shoe horses and worked as a farrier when he was only 16. After he graduated from the military academy, he enrolled in the University of Georgia in Athens. He played football, but he was forced to drop out of football and the university in 1963 when a rodeo accident ended his playing career. He transferred to Truett McDonald Community College, and he graduated with an associate degree in science. Then he did return to the University of Georgia. Despite his father's opposition, though, Tom married for the first time when he was still in college, and that marriage didn't work out. And then his next love and his next wife was Carolyn Brooks, who would be known as Little Carolyn.
Who also happened to be his first wife's best friend.
Yes.
Oops.
So she was also married.
That's true.
Yep.
So 2 divorce suits were filed when Tom's wife and Carolyn's husband discovered their dalliance.
Dalliance. Ooh, fancy words.
Like that?
Yeah.
So Tom managed to stay in college, and he did graduate from the University of Georgia in 1966 with a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. He married Carolyn, and after 5 years and 2 kids together, he and Carolyn divorced. Now, his parents hadn't minded his first divorce, but they were not in favor, nor would they support his second divorce. They kicked him out of the house, and that's when he moved in with Pat's family.
Right. So now, after being away from Pat and spending some time in prison, Tom began to realize that he wasn't very good at choosing women.
Well, it looks like he's 0 for 3 right now. Huh?
Yes. And he rushed into them all.
Yeah.
Which isn't good.
No, it isn't.
So Tom was found guilty of his parents' murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life sentences to run concurrently.
Okay. That's not terrible.
Okay. It's life in prison.
Yeah, but with a chance for parole.
Yes, that's true.
So,
I would say it's still terrible, though, but, you know.
well, they're concurrent, not consecutive, so that's a bonus.
Pat wasn't happy.
Well, no. I mean, she's not happy because he's in prison. There's no money coming in. Her idea of getting him to commit suicide, which I'm convinced if he had done that, she wasn't going to follow suit.
Yeah, I think even he realizes that now.
Yeah, so there's no way there could be any inheritance or anything. She's kind of stuck.
Right, but then she'll glom on to the grandparents.
Yeah, because she figures out, all right, who's got the money?
But I mean, in a way, she was happy to be rid of him in prison. I think her whole plan was to have them all 3 get killed.
That was her initial plan. I'm certainly convinced
She
of
sent
it.
Tom over there. She made the call. She cut the phone line.
Yeah.
It was just a big setup for them all to murder each other.
Right. And now that part sort of worked out.
Sort of.
Maybe not exactly.
No, not exactly.
And there's no money coming from Walter and Carolyn from their estate to Tom.
No.
So where's the money? Pa and Nona have the money. So
And they already had quite a bit of money.
they did. So here's our next targets. Right?
Yes, right, exactly. Well, Kentwood Farms was still heavily mortgaged, and the debt was owed mostly to Tom's grandparents, Pa and Nona. So with Walter and Carolyn dead, and their grandson, Tommy, in prison, the elder Allansons were just a prime target, like you said. So doing her best Southern Belle hostess act, Pat moved the elderly couple into her home and insisted that she be their sole caretaker. So in declining health and with no other family nearby to help them, they were actually thankful for Pat being so generous. So soon Pat had convinced the Allansons that she and Tom, despite the fact that he was a prison inmate, should be the sole heirs of their estate. So the couple actually updated their wills.
Not once, but 2 or 3 times. They kept doing codicils because she would do these little steps.
Yes.
At a time. She didn't do the whole thing all at once. And it was like the final step was that she and Tom were the inheritors.
Yeah, she was quite clever in some ways. She just went too far.
Yeah, got a little too greedy.
Yeah.
And she was going to be the executor of the estate also.
Right. And, of course, living with Pat, Nona's health deteriorated rapidly. Although she'd been sick for a while, she'd had the stroke, she'd never been bedridden, and that's how she was during her stay at Tara, at, Kentwood. And Pa was really heartbroken to see his wife go downhill, but at the same time his health was deteriorating. So in a short time, he'd lost a son and daughter-in-law to murder. His grandson was in prison, and now his wife is bedridden. His daughter was angry and not speaking with him, other to complain about Pat. So to Pa, Pat was the only person who seemed to care about something more than his money, so he was really believing her and depending on her.
Eventually, Pa's daughter, Jean, broke through in her accusations because she'd been suspicious of Pat for quite some time.
Yeah, which had been working against her in the relationship.
Right. So after notifying the authorities of her suspicions, tests followed which showed Nona and Pa both with arsenic in their systems, and surprise testimony from Pat's daughter, Susan, who claims she saw her mother actually put arsenic in the elderly couple's food and drink. So Pat's finally going to face some consequences for her acts. She was tried and convicted and sentenced to 2 10-year prison sentences for attempted murder to be served consecutively. So she was then sent to Hardwick Correctional Institute in Milledgeville, Georgia.
But she was released after what I think is a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, just a very few years.
Yeah. And she's really a narcissistic murderess, being sent out to society, and, she's going to cause more trouble and hurt more people.
Yeah, and here's the, I guess, maybe ironic thing. So she had learned how to help elderly people. That was part of her job in prison.
That's what they taught her, yeah.
So she gets out and she's going to work as an elder care specialist after she's poisoned 2 elderly people.
That's crazy, isn't it?
That's just nuts.
Who's thinking of these things?
I don't know.
Because nobody's watching what's going on. So in searching for employment, Pat convinced a prominent Atlanta, Georgia couple, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Christ, to hire her and her daughter Debbie as home caregivers. So Mr. Christ survived only a short time after Pat began working for them. The Christ family believed that Pat neglected him and poisoned his wife Betty. But what was known for certain was that the mother and daughter team had stolen money and some valuables from the couple, and had lied about her status, saying she was a registered nurse. In June 1991, Pat pled guilty to the charges and served another stint of 8 years in prison. But these were only the thefts. This wasn't for hurting the people.
Correct.
Right. But prison at the same time was giving Tom a lot of time to think. And during his time in prison, he'd come to realize several things. Pat wasn't who she seemed to be. She had used him to orchestrate the murder of his parents. And she would absolutely do anything for money.
Well, that's a good realization.
Yeah, too bad he didn't come up with that sooner.
Took him a while, didn't it?
But it all happened so fast. I mean, really.
Yeah.
Amazingly fast.
I mean, when you're going through the sources for this and listening and reading the book and stuff, it seems like it would have taken years for all this stuff to happen.
Right, right.
And in reality, from the time they were married to the death of Tom's parents was not even 8 weeks.
Really? Wow. I knew it was short, but yeah,
Jeez.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So after serving 15 years, Tom gave some interviews, and he confessed to being the intruder in his parents' basement. What he said happened was that he was waiting in the basement for his mom when his father came home, and it's believed that Pat was the one who made the call to Walter, telling him that something was happening at the house. Tom's father shot at him as he was hiding in that hole in the wall, and then Walter called Carolyn to come down with another gun. So Tom shot a shotgun that was in the hole in the basement twice, and he killed his parents. Pat was released from prison in 1999. She went to live with her stepfather and his new wife, because Marguerite had died, and there she opened a doll shop that she named Pat's Pretty Playthings.
Now that's kind of creepy.
Yeah, that sounds like a horror movie.
Yeah. Yes.
In 2008, so 9 years later, Pat was charged with doctor shopping and fraudulently obtaining over 3,700 painkillers in less than a year. She was officially charged on 3 counts of unauthorized distribution, and she entered a plea agreement with a sentence of probation only. So she got away with that pretty much.
She did. Now, Tom Allanson has used his experience in prison to create a men's post-release program called Set Free Aftercare. Each year he provides a multitude of services, including housing, for men who'd been recently released from prison. His mission is to provide a smoother transition from prison to society living in hopes that fewer inmates will return to crime and ultimately be sent back to prison.
I think that's a valuable thing to do with his life, to make something positive.
Well, he had learned a trade. He had learned water purification stuff in prison. and got that as a job on the outside and was quite successful.
Yeah. I mean, he did kill his parents, so he did need to go to prison, but, I mean,
He
she
did.
really manipulated him into being there.
But he was an easily manipulated person by Pat.
But his father shot at him.
Yeah.
So you could say it's self-defense, although I know once you're in somebody's house, you lose all your rights like that, right?
Right.
But if you're in a basement hiding and someone starts shooting at you and there's a shotgun next to you, you're either going to die or shoot back, probably, because I believe that Walter knew it was him. He hated him. He hated his own son.
Yeah. No, he knew.
Yeah. I don't think Carolyn shot at him, though.
No, she was just carrying the gun down, right?
Yeah. Why'd she even go down there?
Because her husband told her
Yeah,
to.
he was the boss of her, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So there are lots of movies and documentaries we could mention if people want to find out more about this, right?
There are. There's one called Southern Fried Homicide called Fatal Bell.
Yeah. It's kind of a hokey show. I think it's on ID.
There's American Justice, Deadly Magnolia.
That was a good
Patricia
one.
Allanson, that was.
That was well done.
A very well-written book, Everything She Ever Wanted.
Yep, an Anne Rule book.
And Evil In-Law, Love, Greed, and Murder.
So good stuff.
Plenty of sources.
Yeah. So let's remind our listeners of our sponsor for today's episode, Grove Collaborative. Grove is an e-commerce company that makes it easy to discover the best natural products to take care of your home, your family, and never run out of the products. With their own safe, effective, and affordable Grove flagship products, as well as the amazing brands we mentioned like Method, Tom's, and Real Simple, Grove delivers some natural, beautiful, and sustainable products right to your door. So it's a good way to start your transition to a more natural home and to use more natural personal products. Now, especially if you have children or pets, Grove makes you feel good that you're exposing them to only safe products. If you want to sign up for Grove, go to grove.co/brewery and you'll receive a $30 Mrs. Meyer's gift set for free with your order of $20 or more. You don't have to commit to anything else. That's grove.co, not grove.com/brewery. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes. So before we move into feedback, I'd like to take a minute to thank our listeners, our Tie Grabber members, our Patreon supporters, and everyone who takes the time to send us feedback and suggestions. It's the community that's embraced the podcast who make this a fun project that I happily devote hours of my time to every week. We're just happy when you listen and interact, but if you do see value in listening and you'd like an extra episode to listen to once in a while, you can support the podcast by joining Team Tie Grabber at tiegrabber.com. As a member, you'll get access to about 20 members-only TCB episodes and new ones that we release every 3 to 4 weeks. Plus, we'll send you a bottle opener or a snifter after you join, depending on if you're a $3 a month member or a $5 a month member. And I also throw in a few more pieces of swag like stickers, magnets, or coasters. There are other ways to offer some support that don't cost anything. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. You can take a few minutes to leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, because that's very helpful. So I'm going to let Dick start out our feedback with an episode suggestion from Melissa.
Okay, I've been leading off on these for a while.
Yeah, because I always do the talking about Team Tie Grabber, so
Okay.
It works out well.
So Melissa wants us to look into the Katie Plattle incest murder-suicide case. Her adoptive name is Katie Fusco. Pretty dark stuff, I would imagine. Incest, murder, suicide certainly is a bunch of dark topics.
You don't get much worse than that, no.
No. Melissa goes on to say, I really enjoy your podcasts and hope you beat Sword and Scale to this story.
All right, Melissa.
She gives us more credit than we might actually get
From others?
from others.
That's okay.
Okay.
She's a listener. She likes us, so enjoy it.
Anyway, what Melissa writes is a young woman named Katie married her birth father, had a baby with him, and after she decided to leave him, lost her life to him, along with that of their child and her adoptive father. 1995, Stephen Plattle was 20 when he met a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa. She soon became pregnant and gave birth to a girl named Denise. Now, Alyssa, the mother, birth mother, told the Associated Press in an interview that they put the baby up for adoption when she was 8 months old. They were young and poor, she said, and couldn't afford having a kid. But she also believed that her husband or partner, Stephen Plattle, physically abused the baby. Tony Fusco and his wife Kelly adopted the girl. They renamed her Katie and raised her with their biological daughter in Dover which is about 80 miles north of New York City. Katie was an aspiring artist known at Dover High School for drawing comic strips. She planned to attend college and pursue a career in digital advertising. After turning 18, Katie found her birth parents and messaged them. I guess the adoptive parents told her that she was an adopted child.
Yes, I think she knew all along, which is the
Right.
thing to do.
Yeah, I think so. So the Plattles were happy to reunite with Katie. Instead of going to college in August 2016, Katie moved in with the Plattles. Tony and Kelly were apprehensive, but they thought Katie was old enough to make her own decisions and supported her in this. Boy, that's a fine line, though. I'm reading this and thinking about it, and I don't know that I'd let my daughter go off to live with her birth parents without knowing a whole bunch of stuff.
But she's 18, so is it really up to them? I mean, they could try and talk her out of it, but
I guess it's not.
yeah.
Now, all was not well in the Plattle home. Stephen and Alyssa had already decided to separate, and they were sleeping in separate rooms. Alyssa Plattle said she had been suffering emotional and verbal abuse by her husband for years. And she also told Katie privately that Stephen Plattle had abused her as a baby and that her major reason for the adoption was her own safety. Now, according to Alyssa, Katie didn't appear to be too concerned about this. Stephen Plattle's behavior changed after he met Katie, according to his wife, Alyssa. He began wearing skinny jeans and form-fitting shirts. He shaved his beard, let his hair grow long. He's unaging. I just made that up.
Nice.
About 6 weeks after Katie moved in, Stephen Plattle slept on the floor in her room. Now, this certainly concerned Alyssa. Now, he did it again the next night, and she confronted him about it. He said it was none of her business and stormed out of the house with Katie. So Alyssa Plattle moved out, and she shared custody of the 2 children that she had with Stephen. In May 2017, she learned from her 11-year-old daughter's journal of an incestuous relationship and Katie's subsequent pregnancy. Her daughter wrote that she and her sister were told by Stephen Plattle to refer to Katie as their stepmother. July 2017, 2 months after his divorce from Alyssa was finalized, and amidst an ongoing police investigation, Stephen Plattle married Katie and parked in Maryland. They lied on their application, saying they were unrelated. Now, meanwhile, the adoptive parents thought there was nothing they could do and decided it was best to support Katie. Well, can't you bring charges?
Of incest?
Yeah.
Well, I think that did happen.
So Katie gave birth to a baby boy named Bennett in September. She and Stephen moved to a house on a cul-de-sac in North Carolina. They were arrested on incest charges in January. A judge ordered them not to contact each other. Stephen Plattle's mother had custody of the newborn. After the arrest, Katie moved back with Tony and Kelly Fusco. In April of 2018, Katie and Tony Fusco left their home. In a minivan nearby, Stephen Plattle was watching them leave. Minutes later, in nearby New Milford, witnesses reported somebody opening fire. Katie, Tony Fusco were fatally shot. Stephen Plattle was later found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot. In the 911 call, Stephen's mother told the dispatcher her son said he had killed the baby. He left the baby dead. He told me to call the police and I shouldn't go over there. The caller then said Stephen admitted to killing his wife and her adoptive father. And police did find the baby dead and alone in Katie and Stephen's home.
It's a dreadful case.
Oh,
What a nightmare.
it certainly is. Should we do it?
Maybe.
Okay, I think a maybe is probably the best I can
Put
do
it
right
in the
now.
maybe pile. Okay.
Melissa, good case.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Good recommendation.
Kind of grossed me out, though.
Yeah, it's supposed to.
It did.
Okay, so now I have 2 letters with differing opinions on our recent episode, Help Save the Next Girl. So first, we're going to read one from Alana. A good podcast on a grim case. Agree, Jill, that friends should watch over friends, but if they're all drinking, a designated sober member might have difficulty keeping friends together and intact. I'm going to make a stronger suggestion. When women are out in public, concerts, bars, etc., don't overdo the drinking. If one's mental faculties are diminished, awareness of safety versus danger also diminishes. Can't count how many young girls have gone missing or been attacked, raped, murdered after too much drinking and lost awareness of surroundings. Frat parties can be problematic. Save this for private house gatherings. Overall, don't put your drink down anywhere. For self-protection, Drinks can be spiked, even by a bartender. In our area, someone spiked the punch with antifreeze at a New Year's Eve party 6 or 7 years ago, and several people died and others got very sick. Avoid punch bowl drinks too. Most people, as a rule, never commit such furtive acts, but it's Russian roulette to take a chance. We can have spontaneous fun without endangering ourselves. Not much fun if too much drinking to even remember it. So, the other one I have from Katie is like on the opposite side of this, and I think we can discuss, should women be responsible for keeping them safe, or should we hold men responsible to not do things to them, is kind of what we're at. So let's read this from Katie.
Okay.
Hi, Jill and Dick. My name is Katie, and I love your podcast, and I've been listening from the very beginning. My husband is a giant beer geek, so I love your beer reviews. You should pick something from Toronto, where we are from. We have amazing breweries here. Jill, I have a bone to pick with you regarding your past episode, Help Save the Next Girl. I've only listened to half of it so far, but I'm very surprised to see you admonishing Morgan's friends, and women in general, for allowing friends to go home alone or with men while intoxicated. This is so far from being realistic, or even logically achievable, not to mention it is again placing blame for male violence on women. I am someone who spent the better part of my youth and early mid-20s at a neighborhood pub, drinking with my girlfriends. We all lived a 10 to 20-minute walk from the pub and would regularly meet up several times a week for drinks, more often than not for one too many. And we would almost always, because we lived in opposite directions of the bar, get home alone. Sometimes this was walking, biking, perhaps while listening to music or taking a cab. To expect each of us to drop one another off, or even to have a buddy, assumes we'd need to live next door to one another or in the same house for it to work correctly. Even so, this doesn't take into account the many times one person would leave individually to meet others, go to a party, or go home with a guy, which, yes, happens. The guy I went home with is now my husband, smiley face. And yes, while I'm a much safer, cautious 34-year-old with a much healthier liver, I have to say that your position on what may have saved this girl is vastly unrealistic. Can you imagine yourself as a 20-year-old trying to tell a friend she couldn't go home with a guy she met at a bar, and actually trying to intervene in this circumstance? Women drink, women sometimes drink too much, women walk home alone, and women go home with guys they've met at a bar. Trying to fight against these realities while assuming that the only solution is a puritanical woman that doesn't engage in these behaviors and follows other women around in an attempt to prevent them is part of the problem in the first place, and fails to place the blame appropriately, which, as you both know at this point, is almost always a man. Why can't we talk about how men can modify their behavior to save lives? Morgan was an adult woman who made choices. These same choices have been made by almost everyone I know. I recognize that I'm very lucky that nothing ever happened to me when I'm younger, but I certainly don't think female behavior could have prevented Morgan's rape and murder. Peace and love to you both, and to Morgan and Hannah. XOXO. So I can agree with both of these letters,
Well, yeah.
to a certain extent.
Right.
You can give me your opinion.
I would tell you I like Katie's thoughts, but the reality is ultimately it comes down to the woman on making the decisions.
Yeah, you need to elaborate, because that sounds bad. Well, elaborate why.
I think that both men and women should be educated, yes. But it's the woman who's being asked to go home with a guy or be picked up by a guy or drink with a guy or any of those things. And it's going to come down to her decisions.
Well, is there something that we could teach men? I think there probably is something we could teach men.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I have the name from my group here. It's going to be called Don't Be That Guy.
Nice. I like that. Help save the next girl, don't be that guy.
Right.
I wonder if there's anything like that out there, because that's a great idea.
And I would wholeheartedly agree with Katie that men need to be more educated on this.
Okay.
And I think they are. But it takes a long time. And it's not something that's going to be solved quickly. So in the absence of men behaving better, it is going to come down on the woman to be able to make the right choices.
To protect each other and themselves.
Right. And yes, I can see myself as a 20-year-old woman telling a friend, don't go home with that guy, which is something...
I've done it. And I don't know if it's puritanical. I mean, you're looking out for her.
Yeah. But even if you've done that, it's still ultimately the woman's decision to do what she's going to do.
Sure.
So you can say, Jill, you've had enough to drink. I don't think you should go home with that guy. and you say, but I'm going to, and off you go.
Yes, and then it's that woman's decision.
Right,
And if the man does anything to her, it's absolutely all his fault.
exactly.
But you do have to protect yourself from people who do bad things.
Yeah,
And that's the problem I have with Katie's letter is Katie's saying, you're saying you're very lucky that nothing happened to you, and I am too. But can we just decide that we're all going to just hope we're lucky because we want to have our freedom and we shouldn't have to? I mean, I agree we shouldn't have to change our behavior. But in reality, you have to do more than be lucky. And you do need to look out for each other.
and in the same standpoint, guys got to look out for each other, and
And guys could look out for girls more.
they
Nice
could.
guys.
Yeah,
I mean, we've seen, was it Lauren Spear, where many young men saw her and knew she was in no condition and didn't help
it
her.
didn't help.
So it's not just women that should look out for each other.
No,
But then when you're talking about, like the case with Hannah and Morgan, this wasn't a guy she was going to go out with. This is totally different.
yeah.
She was off wandering alone in the dark and severely impaired, it seems like.
It seems like, but nobody did anything.
Yeah, so I do blame her friends, although I also blame the venue for not letting her in, at least getting her a cab, bringing her in, and calling someone to help her. You know, they
Morgan.
wouldn't let her come back in. Morgan, yes.
Yeah, and she'd been injured, and nobody did anything about that.
Right. So I
But-
would say, yeah, men and women.
Yes, I think I would say, obviously, that both sexes need to be better informed and educated.
Educated in what specific way?
Basic manners,
Decency?
decency
Yeah.
type of thing.
And safety.
Yes,
And it's great to think that we could live in a nice little town and ride our bikes to the pub and get drunk and find our way home. Sure. But that's not reality in most places. That's
no,
dangerous.
and you got to be careful. And I don't think working that way is suggesting that it's all the woman's fault. I'm just saying use your common sense.
Yeah, so her question, why can't we talk about how men can modify their behavior to save lives?
We certainly can.
We can. I think we could talk more about that, and we didn't. But then I also agree with Alana that it's really not safe to go out and get drunk. And I might sound uptight, I probably sound like your mother, but it's not. And we see what happens to girls. You are taking a chance with your life.
If you get impaired, your judgment sucks, and you can make wrong decisions.
Yes. And you can't totally count on your girlfriends or your one designated driver to keep you out of trouble. Like you said, one girl might run off regardless of what you say.
And that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, you did. You did.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think they both make good points.
Very good points.
Yeah. But I just don't think, Katie, that it's realistic to be allowed to do that. Well, I mean, you're allowed to, obviously, but it's just not realistic to think that's a safe thing to do, obviously. But I would like to think that if a woman does leave impaired, that there are nice men and women who would do something and not just let her wander off alone in the dark, drunk.
Right, because
Right.
that's a different aspect of it.
Yes. Because that's not even talking about going home with a guy. That's talking about being picked up by a monster, raped and murdered, which is what happened with Morgan and Hannah.
Yes,
And they both seemed impaired and alone.
and alone.
And they didn't purposely go with a guy either. They were just allowed to wander off without anybody looking out for them. So I like that you have your counterpart to help save the next girl. Don't be that guy. So I think in your retirement, that could be your gift to society.
Okay, I'll start working on it.
Okay, great. So thanks, Alana and Katie. I think both of those letters were really great for discussion.
And
Important.
thought-provoking.
Yes.
We like that.
I think we do need to think more about the behavior of men as well as women.
We do,
Yeah.
definitely. Okay, I have a question and a case suggestion from Nicole. Dear Jill and Dick, I love the podcast and proud to be a Tie Grabber supporter. Thank you, Nicole. I love the beer reviews, and although I've never been a fan of beer before, Dick's love for the brew has gotten me interested. I'm wondering if you have any recommendation for a good starter beer for a teetotaler who likes sweet stuff. Well, I think, Nicole, just to answer this question before we get into your case recommendation, is that you should try one of the common ones. When you say teetotaler, does that mean you've never had beer?
Well, it says good starter beer, so I'm thinking she doesn't really drink beer. Kind of sounds like maybe she's tasted it.
Okay. So I think any of the lighter Hefeweizen wheat beer type things, summer beers, those are good beers to get you started.
What
I
about
think-
like one of those fruity beers, like Sea Dog, Blueberry? That
Well, Yeah, she likes sweet stuff, she says, so
Yeah.
I suppose. I just think most of those are crap.
But you don't like sweet stuff.
Well, I do like sweet stuff. Maybe not
None
my
of the
beer.
beers that you review are sweet, no.
But I think I would go with a lighter, summery beer. And yes, the Sea Dog makes a blueberry one. There's plenty of brewers that make apricot ones, blueberry ones, other berries. But I think we're coming into a good time of year for newbies to try beer for the first time or expand their palates a little.
Yeah, maybe on one of our upcoming cases you could do one of those beers.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, great.
Okay, so on to my case recommendation from Nicole. It's the murder of Steve Ricco. Steve and his wife Kim were college sweethearts that lived in Laurel, Maryland with their young daughter. He was a landscaper at a golf course, and she was a nurse. So during a rough patch in their marriage, Steve booked a romantic weekend away in nearby St. Michael's in hopes of saving his marriage. On the first night there is a fire in the room that killed Steve. Kim claims that Steve was drunk and being aggressive, and she left him to sleep it off in the room while she went to visit friends. However, medical examiners find that Steve had no smoke in his lungs or large amounts of alcohol, and they're trying to figure out what really happened. They don't have to look long as several of Kim's friends and co-workers come forward to report that she discussed killing her husband and even tried to hire someone to kill him.
Another genius. Wow.
So it turns out that Kim was having an affair with a young married Marine and was convinced that because she made more than he, she would be forced to pay Steve alimony if she tried to divorce him.
So we've heard this before, the getting out of alimony by killing someone. That is the stupidest idea ever. You would rather end up in prison than pay half your money or whatever to take care of your ex or your kids. It's so stupid. And it never seems to work.
It doesn't.
Of course, if it worked, we probably wouldn't know about it, but...
Well, probably not. That's true. So this murder was featured on both Snapped and Murderous Affairs, and there is a book about it. It's an interesting case that I would love to hear your take on it, especially since there's a medical aspect that I'm sure Dick would love.
Yeah. Okay, so Lynn S. has a comment on a beer in a case also. Just wanted to drop a line. I'm a new listener, so this may have already been cleared up, but I listened to your podcast when Dick reviewed Ommegang?
Brewery Ommegang.
Game of Thrones beer. I heard the question about the association with the show, and I wanted to chime in. My husband and I visit the brewery in Cooperstown regularly, and we found out. HBO Game of Thrones contacted Ommegang out of the blue a few years ago and expressed their admiration for the brewery's commitment to true Belgian-style brewing. They asked Ommegang to produce a line of beers to be released as Game of Thrones beers. They were happy to do it, and the series of brews, it continues now, the most recent being a barley wine called Hand of the Queen.
I just bought that. It's sitting in my beer fridge.
Oh, all right.
It's beckoning me.
So you think it'll be good. They make good beers.
Ommegang makes wonderful beers. As Lynn said, they're Belgian beers, so they tend to have this yeasty, sugary character to them. But they brew amazing beers. I've had a whole pile of Ommegang beers.
All right. It crossed my mind again since seeing in the news last night that a brewery is being sued for making a Breaking Bud spoof beer based on the Breaking Bad series without permission.
Yeah.
And we just talked about that the other day.
We did. And the label is a blatant ripoff of Breaking Bad's intro.
Yeah.
With the chemical symbols and the squares and everything.
And the smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clever, but they're probably going to have to do something to change it.
Well, they probably should have gotten permission.
It would have helped.
Yeah.
Now, what I think they ought to do, and someone had mentioned this to me, is say, we'll withdraw it, and then they immediately put out the same beer. It's all Goodman Ale or something like that.
Oh, geez. Yeah, that would be asking for trouble.
Yeah, you get slapped again.
Right. So she also has a case suggestion. I'm an avid trial watcher, and I was captivated by the Leon Jacob trial. He's truly the most accurate example of a sociopath I've ever seen, aside from Hollywood film portrayals. The story is so unbelievable, it couldn't be a movie. It's just too strange. But as you know, truth is stranger than fiction. You've already mentioned this case or have it in the works for a future edition, but I wanted to mention it. Can't wait to hear more from you two, and I'm asking my family for a subscription to your podcast for my birthday. So fingers crossed I'll be a subscriber soon. Well, thanks, Lynn. So a little bit about the case that she suggested. So Jacob, a 39-year-old failed Houston doctor, was arrested with his girlfriend a prominent Montrose veterinarian, in an alleged scheme to kill their exes.
Oh, I like this already.
The couple
So
met...
how come he's a failed doctor?
I don't remember. I do vaguely remember this case. It was on 2020 or something, and I think we did talk about it a little, but I don't remember the details. But the couple met with a hitman at an Olive Garden in Houston, and the plan was to kill her ex-husband in a carjacking gone awry, while his ex-girlfriend would be kidnapped and then killed. And they were willing to pay thousands. There was only one problem. The man they were meeting with was actually an undercover police officer.
Whoops.
Valerie McDonald, 48, and 39-year-old Leanne Jacob, reportedly a prominent Houston veterinarian, and her boyfriend, were charged with solicitation of capital murder, both accused of hiring the fake hitman to kill their exes.
Yeah, they didn't do their homework, did they?
No.
You never talk to an undercover cop to murder your spouse.
Well, I mean, obviously they didn't know it was an undercover cop, right?
No, but they probably started out approaching somebody to do it, and word got to the police, so the police set up somebody undercover.
But thank God they did and didn't do it themselves, because the people didn't end up getting killed.
They didn't end up dead.
Yeah.
All right, we got Sarah W., a case suggestion. I love the podcasts. I've become slightly obsessed with them, in truth. I listen as I drive my long commute. I would love to suggest a murder case for you and Dick. Erin Chorney was a young girl who was murdered in Brandon, Manitoba, Canada. To bring her murderer to justice, the RCMP had to complete a major sting operation. Oh, we love those.
I think someone mentioned this to us back when we were doing Sebastian Burns and
Yeah,
Rafe.
I think that was one of the examples of a sting that worked the way it was supposed to.
Right, right.
It took a long time for the murder to be solved, although most of us from the area had an idea of who had done it. There is now a book and a documentary on the case, and it's always fascinated me. Thank you for everything you do. So this is 2 years after 18-year-old Erin Chorney vanished. Her former boyfriend, who was accused of killing her, was tricked into confessing by undercover cops posing as criminals. Crown Prosecutor Bob Morrison said an elaborate 4-month sting drew 3 different confessions from Michael Bradley Bridges. Each was more detailed in the hope he might finally be accepted by the boss as a full-fledged member of the fake gang. In his final confession in February of 2004, Bridges told police he attempted to strangle and then drown Chorney in his house. He allegedly left her in the bathtub for almost an entire day before burying her in someone's fresh grave, in a Brandon, Manitoba cemetery. So that's not going to go undiscovered for very long.
Why?
Well, as soon as they want to use the fresh grave.
Well, I think maybe it already had a person in it, and they buried her on top of the coffin, is the way I read it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, freshly covered grave.
All right.
Or maybe he dropped her in the bottom of it and just covered her enough so they'd put the coffin on top of it.
Possibly. That's true.
It's kind of clever in a sick way.
So Chorney's disappearance on April 2002 is the subject of a nationwide missing person search and remained a compelling mystery for a long time. She and Bridges had already split up the night she disappeared. He had been charged a few weeks earlier with assaulting her. He told police she is still alive but might be brain dead, so he cut the cord from a hairdryer and used it to pull her up off the ground. When he realized Chorney was still breathing, he filled the tub and held her under.
So how do we feel about this? Does the ends justify the means?
Well, we talked about that.
Yeah.
And my take was no, they don't. But in this case, they apparently got justice.
Right, right.
But no, I don't think the end justifies the means.
But it's harder to say in a case like this where you feel like he definitely did it. Although most of our listeners feel like Rafe and Burns definitely did it too. So
That they do.
Yeah.
I would also say that, if people in the area were so certain that he was guilty, there should have been a way of bringing him to trial.
Without the confession.
Without his confession.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal was.
Right.
I'd have to look into it more to see what
That'd
they
be
had.
something to check out, don't you think?
Yes, I
All
think
right.
it's an interesting one. So
Good
thank
deal.
you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback and your suggestions. And we'll have more next week on the next episode of True Crime Brewery. And until then, we'll be waiting for you at the quiet end, patiently drinking our beers.
We've got some beer for you. Come on down.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.